It was a Sunday afternoon in December 1891. A young woman, an immigrant, far from home, working as a servant in rural New Jersey, walked into the woods with a man she trusted. Within days, newspapers across 5 states were printing her name. Except, they couldn't agree on what her name actually was. In Delaware, she was Ella Putro. In Arizona, she was Ella Petrus. In Kansas, she was Ella Patrula. In Pennsylvania, she was Ella Petravia. 4 newspapers, 4 different states, 4 different names, all writing about the same woman, all writing about the same crime. And here's what makes this story remarkable. In 1891, a working-class immigrant woman had almost no power, no status, no voice that anyone in authority was required to listen to. But she refused to disappear. This is the story of what happened to her. Tonight, we are using the original newspaper articles to follow her story as the public first read it. This is Headlines from History. But to understand this case, you first have to understand the world where it happened. It is December 1891. Former President Grover Cleveland is preparing for a political comeback. Across America, newspapers are filled with fierce debates over silver coinage, railroad monopolies, and the growing divide between wealthy industrialists and struggling farmers. Across the Atlantic, the shadow of Jack the Ripper murders still lingers in the public imagination, haunting headlines and frightening readers on both sides of the ocean. And in the quiet rural communities of Monmouth County, life moves at a far slower pace. Horse-drawn wagons creak down muddy roads. Winter winds sweep across isolated farmhouses. Neighbors know one another by name. And when something terrible happens, word travels not by telephone or radio, but through whispers, handwritten letters, and the next morning's newspaper. It was here, in this quiet corner of New Jersey, that a disturbing story began to unfold. The place is called Nut Swamp, a small, isolated farming settlement in Monmouth County, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where a young woman with no family nearby is entirely dependent on the goodwill of her employers. Her name, at least as I can piece together today, was likely something close to Ella Putro, or perhaps Petravia, maybe Petrusa. No one seems to have known for certain back then. The newspaper reporters covering the case all spelled her name differently, writing it down phonetically as they heard it spoken aloud through heavy accents, second-hand accounts, and hurried interviews. In the newspapers of the time, her identity shifted from article to article, almost as if even the press could not fully grasp who she was. Most reports described her as a young Hungarian woman, but at least one newspaper referred to her instead as a Swedish servant girl. Another contradiction in a case already filled with confusion, rumor, and uncertainty. More than a century later, even her true name remains partially lost to history. What we do know is this: she was young and most likely Hungarian. She was described by the Wilmington Daily Republican on December 17, 1891, as a comely Hungarian girl. She had been working as a domestic servant in the household of a man named Richard Crawford for approximately 3 years. She was, by every account, far from home, in a country whose language was not her first, in a community where her entire world revolved around the Crawford household. She had one constant in her life outside of work: a man named Thomas Timothy. Now, Thomas Timothy was a farmhand. Junior, his father shared the name. He worked the land in and around Morrisville, the nearby township, and somewhere along the way he had begun calling on Ella. The Jersey City News, published December 18, 1891, described the situation in a single spare sentence tucked into its State Notes column. Thomas Timothy, a farmhand, is confined in the freehold jail charged with trying to poison Ella Putro at Morrisville. Timothy and the girl were in love. Timothy and the girl were in love. That line is doing a great deal of work. It tells you how the press, and presumably the public, initially framed this story. Not as predator and victim, not as betrayal and attempted murder, as a love story gone wrong, a tragic affair, the kind of thing that happens when passions run too high. We'll come back to that framing. Because what actually happened on that Sunday in December
was not a love story. The exact date was likely Sunday, December 14th, 1891. We know this because the first newspaper reports appeared on December 17th, referencing events that had unfolded over the previous several days.
That Sunday, Ella was out walking. Timothy approached her. The Arizona Republican, in its December 24th, 1891 edition, reported that he induced her to take some liquid, telling her it would not hurt her. She trusted him. She swallowed it. What he gave her was Paris green. Paris green was a vivid emerald-colored powder used primarily as an insecticide in rat poison. It contained copper and arsenic. It was readily available on any farm, and it was lethal. Within hours, Ella was attacked with severe sickness, according to the Arizona Republican. She was back at the Crawford household, and her condition deteriorated so rapidly that by the time her had passed, according to the statement she later gave to the public prosecutor, a statement made while she believed she was dying, the public prosecutor was summoned to her bedside to take what was known at the time as an ante-mortem statement. In other words, a formal deathbed declaration. The authorities did not believe she would survive long enough to ever testify in court. The Wilmington Daily Republican on December 17th, 1891 reported, Ella Putro, a Hungarian girl, was reported dying, and her sickness was of such a sudden and mysterious nature that the public prosecutor was called to take her ante-mortem statement. She told the prosecutor everything. She named Timothy. She described the woods. She described the dark liquid. She said she believed it was poison. She said he had betrayed her. And then she told him something that turned a poisoning case into something far more devastating. On Tuesday, December 16th, Ella gave birth. The baby, Timothy's child, lived only a few hours. By Wednesday afternoon, December 17th, law enforcement went looking for Thomas Timothy. The Goodland Republic in Kansas, one of the papers that picked up the story nationally, reported on December 23rd that Timothy cannot be found at first. But he was located and arrested. He was taken to the Freehold Jail in Monmouth County, where he would await trial. His response to the charges? The Wilmington Daily Republican reported it plainly. He denies all knowledge of the occurrence. Here is where this case becomes genuinely remarkable for the era. This was not a story about a famous person. It was not a story about wealth or politics or scandal among the powerful. It was the story of a Hungarian immigrant servant girl in a rural New Jersey farming community, near death from poison, her newborn child already gone. And it ran everywhere. Within days of the first reports appearing in New Jersey papers, the story had been picked up by newspapers across the country. Why did this story travel so far so fast? I think partly because the story contained elements that Victorian newspaper readers found impossible to look away from. For several weeks after the initial reports, the newspapers went quiet on Ella's condition. The story moved to Timothy, his confinement at Freehold Jail, the investigation, the gathering of evidence. The New York World carried a follow-up on January 29, 1892, noting that the trial of Thomas Timothy of Morrisville was proceeding on the charge of having administered a dose of Paris green to his intended bride. His intended bride. Again, notice the framing. Even as late as January 1892, newspapers were still describing Ella as Timothy's bride, softening the nature of what he had done to her, romanticizing a relationship in which he had gotten her pregnant, then taken her to the woods and poisoned her. The trial proceeded through late January 1892, and then came the verdict. On January 29, 1892, the New York World reported, "The trial of Thomas Timothy of Morrisville on the charge of having administered a dose of Paris green to his intended bride, Ella Petrova, a Swedish servant girl, ended this morning in a verdict of guilty." Thomas Timothy was guilty. And here is the moment the story turns completely. Because the reason Thomas Timothy was convicted was not solely the ante-mortem statement Ella had given from her deathbed in December. Ella Putro had survived, and she walked into that courtroom. The New York World reported, "It was shown that after Timothy had got the girl into trouble, he induced her to accompany him into the woods, where he produced a bottle of poison and made her swallow its contents. The girl recovered and appeared as a witness against Timothy. She appeared as a witness against him. Think about what that took. In 1891, as a Hungarian immigrant woman, with no family network in this country, with a dead child, having nearly died herself, standing in a courtroom in Freehold, New Jersey, and pointing at the man who had done this to her, and telling a jury exactly what happened in those woods. Thomas Timothy had counted on her dying. The newspapers had counted on her dying. The prosecutor had taken her statement assuming she would die. She didn't. On February 18, 1892, Judge Conover sentenced Thomas Timothy at Freehold, 4 years, hard labor, plus the costs of the prosecution. The Shenandoah Herald in Pennsylvania covered the sentencing on February 18, 1892, and added a detail that says everything about how 19th century justice worked for immigrant women. The sentence has caused considerable comment because of its lightness. He had poisoned a woman. He had killed an unborn child. He had left her for dead in the woods of rural New Jersey. He had been convicted at trial, with the surviving victim testifying against him. 4 years. The public apparently agreed this was not enough. Newspapers from Pennsylvania to New Jersey noted the dissatisfaction with the outcome. But 4 years was what Thomas Timothy received. And Ella Putro, or Petrus, or Petravia, or Petrula, the woman whose name no American journalist could spell, whose nationality no American newspaper could agree on, who had come to this country to work and had nearly been murdered in a New Jersey forest, walked out of that courtroom having done the thing she came to do. She made him face what he had done. History did not preserve Ella's life beyond February 1892. We don't know what became of her after the trial. We don't know if she stayed in New Jersey or returned to Hungary or moved somewhere else entirely. 4 years of hard labor. That was the sentence. But after a young woman was taken into the woods of rural Monmouth County, poisoned, abandoned, and left believing she would die, many readers at the time questioned whether justice had truly been served. A baby was dead. She herself was expected to die, and yet the punishment was only 4 years of hard labor. What do you think? Was that sentence enough? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And thank you for watching Headlines from History. If you enjoy forgotten historical stories told through original newspaper accounts, please consider subscribing.